On May 26, 2008, I was dealing with a patient in my father's old house in the village of Akka in Kudahia. The patient was a young boy around 10 or 13 years old, an ancient jinn, over 2,000 years old, had afflicted the boy with ailments. The family found him staring at photos at night, screaming, and then he would run into the forest. Returning to the house after 2 to 3 days, I dripped the boy's blood onto a copper tray. I handed the papers with inscriptions to his parents, instructing them to burn them. When I signaled and told them to hold their child as tightly as possible, we poured the ashes of the papers onto the bloody tray and recited prayers. The young one weakened and fainted. We continued after the session. The father and I talked. Your son will be at ease for a while, but be cautious. Keep him away from objects and places like mirrors, photographs, open windows. Don't let him sleep alone at night, I advised. Then I bid them farewell. At that moment, in my garden, I had guests waiting for me to finish my work. My aunt, her son, and my uncle were in the garden. After seeing the family off, my aunt called out. She mentioned that there was someone in need of help and asked if I could meet her. I agreed, and she brought a young lady into my room. My aunt and the young lady were waiting for me. Son, this girl's name is Daphne. Do you remember her? My aunt asked. I couldn't recall, but I said, my eyes are biting from somewhere. Daphne was silent. My aunt continued. You used to play together when you were little. She's Nasi Uncle's daughter. I vaguely started remembering my childhood was spent in Bursa. The Daphnes live there too. My father was good friends with Nasu. My aunt and Daphne were waiting for me. Come in. Sit down, I said, and started asking questions. Daphne had become a psychologist after studying. She was a knowledgeable, intelligent girl. She began to tell her story. Sedef, her sister, was very intelligent and a brilliant girl. She had just started university after my father passed away. My mother, Sedef, and I lived as 3 women. But one day, Sedef said she wanted to move to a separate house with her friends. She had some very strange friends. One night around 2 o'clock to 3 o'clock, the doorbell rang at our house. When I looked at the security camera, I saw it was Sedef. She was walking oddly. When I opened the door, I saw that her clothes were soaked in blood, and her hands and arms were covered in scratches. There was an expression on her face as if saying, "Help me." She collapsed before I could say anything. My mother rushed her to the hospital. I went to Sedef's house. I rang the bell, but no one answered. I opened the door with spare keys and went to the kitchen. She had stabbed her roommate. Nay, I didn't know what to do. I called the police. Niswan wasn't deep-docked after a lot of pleading and money. We agreed not to press charges, but we understood why would Sedef do such a thing. When we asked, nay, she didn't want to answer. We didn't insist. I asked my family if they had asked Sedef about what happened. They said they had, but when the topic came up, Sedef started crying, had difficulty breathing, and couldn't answer. After learning all this from Daphne, we had our tea. I told my aunt to give Daphne a room and we would leave in the morning. My aunt and her son lived with me. My uncle's house was nearby. When everyone went to their rooms at night, the silence of the night was broken by a scream coming from the next room. It was coming from my room. The one screaming was Daphne. When I knocked on the door, she didn't respond, but I could feel her breathing behind the door. My aunt and her son also came to me. I told my aunt to come in. She entered and came back out. "It's nothing, my child. She's asleep," she said. I asked if they heard the screaming, and if not, why they woke up. They heard the sound, but said it came from the street in the village. It was unusual for women to be out on the street at this hour, but I didn't want to insist too much anyway. "May Allah give her comfort," I said, and we returned to our beds. It was morning. My aunt had prepared breakfast, and my cousin had brought fresh eggs and milk from the farm. Daphne had also woken up. I asked if she had slept well last night. She thanked me and said she was comfortable. While she was sitting in the courtyard, I took the opportunity to enter my room and start preparing my things. At that moment, Daphne's necklace caught my attention. It was an ancient necklace, more commonly used by Iranian scholars, symbolizing King Solomon. I placed the necklace back in its spot with my suitcases. I went downstairs. After breakfast, we gathered our things, said goodbye to my aunt and her son, and got into Daphne's car. The journey from Kudahia to Bursa wasn't too long. Daphne started a conversation. "So, where did you learn these things?" she asked. "I learned from my father," I replied. Daphne seemed somewhat interested in these matters. "I don't want you to misunderstand me, but I see these events as somewhat psychologically rooted," she said. I asked if it's psychological. "Why couldn't you heal your brother?" "I don't know," she replied. I suggested we should stop somewhere nearby. She asked for the reason. I explained that we needed to make a salve, and for that, we needed mountain flowers and nettles. She suggested we could have bought them from an herbalist. "If you're going to use nettles to communicate with a jinn, you have to allow the plant to bite you. Only things that cause harm to a human can be effective in these matters." We pulled over on the side of the road. Daphne was talking on the phone in front of the car, and I was gathering flowers. I told her that if she could wait a bit longer, I wanted to perform the midday prayer. She said it wouldn't be a problem. Then we hit the road again. By noon, our journey had come to an end. We were in Bursa, in a resort town called Zaytunbak. Usually, it was quiet here in winter and spring. This town, situated at the edge of a cliff, was mostly inhabited by summer vacationers. Daphne asked about the arrival time of her mother and brother. She said they would spend the day at the hospital and return home in the evening. We drove towards the beach. Daphne took out the folding chairs from the trunk while she sat by the sea, smoking. I tried to gather information. "Are there people who are enemies of your family?" I asked. She said it wasn't possible. They were a closed-off family, not well known even in this area. Their house resembled a mansion. It was getting dark, and there weren't many people around. At that moment, I saw headlights coming down the hill. "Could that be your family's car, Daphne?" I asked. "Yes, that's them," she replied. The car pulled up to the house. Her mother and Sedef got out. Sedef looked pale, her eyes empty. We shook hands one by one. Then Daphne took Sedef's arm and led her upstairs. I stayed downstairs with her mother. "I remember you, so "You've grown up and become an expert in these matters," she said. I smiled. "Please help us." "My child," she pleaded. I assured her that I would do my best. After Daphne took Sedef to her room, she joined us. We hadn't entered the house yet. At that moment, my gaze shifted to Sedef's room. She was glaring at me with eyes full of hatred. I ignored her, not wanting her family to notice. The more I ignored her, the angrier she became, pounding on the window. I could hear the sound of glass hitting glass. It felt like glass shards were piercing my brain every time she hit the window, but I couldn't show any reaction. "Shall we go inside?" her mother suggested, and we entered the house. Prayers, prayer beads, and charms were scattered throughout the house. We sat on the living room couch and started talking. Her mother began to narrate. "The things that have happened to us in the past month have devastated us. My daughter is the most beautiful girl around here. Everyone used to line up to marry her son. But she changed after leaving this house. She became someone else later. She stabbed her friend. We took her to the doctor, called psychologists to the house. But she didn't get better." I asked, "Did anything unusual happen during these incidents?" After a moment of thought, her mother mentioned that there were marks and bruises on her daughter's body, as if she had been beaten. She also said that mud and dirt constantly came out from under her daughter's nails, but because they kept her room locked all the time, it wasn't possible. The situation was somewhat clear. Later, Daphne sat next to me. "Look, Seymour, can we really trust you?" she asked. I nodded and said, "Yes." She asked her mother to bring the CD. I inquired, "What is this CD?" They explained that it contained the camera recordings from the student house where Sedef stayed. They had obtained the footage with great difficulty and only made one copy to prevent Nay, Sedef's roommate, from blackmailing them in the future. We went to the study to watch the recordings on the CD. The images were disturbing. In the kitchen footage, initially there was nothing unusual. Then Sedef opened the refrigerator, took out a jug and poured herself a glass of water. When she went to put the jug back, she paused for a moment. She walked to the window next to the refrigerator and stared at it senselessly for a while. She stayed in front of the window from 1:20 to 1:36. Then her glass jug fell to the ground. Simultaneously with the jug falling, the window shattered. Upon hearing these sounds, Nay came into the kitchen. Sedef tried to pull her away to prevent her from stepping on the glass. Sedef pushed her to the ground and began stabbing her with a knife she took from the kitchen drawer. There was a struggle between them for a while. When they became motionless, Sedef closed the door and started running. I asked, "So, was Sedef's house close to your house?" They said there was at least a half-hour distance between the two houses. They claimed that Sedef used to walk to their house. However, walking that distance in that condition, especially at night, seemed impossible. There was something fishy about this situation, but I didn't want to say it out loud. I instructed Daphne to bring the flowers and herbs I had gathered, and told her mother to close all the windows and doors in the house. We needed to find out what those who did this to her wanted. After all my instructions were followed, we went up to Sedef's room. When the door was unlocked, Sedef was sitting on the bed, waiting for us. The ominous-looking girl who had been peeking through the window was gone, replaced by someone who seemed like an angel. "Dear Sedef, we are here to help you. Tell us what's going on," I said. She looked at her mother and sister when they nodded in approval. She began to speak. "It started with nightmares at night. I kept having the same nightmare. I saw myself at the edge of a cliff. It was as if there were two of me, and to prevent myself from falling down, I was trying to hold on. I would turn my head and see him as Sedef continued to speak. She was crying. Her mother and sister were also in tears. Then we would fall down the cliff together. First, I would fall. I would die, but still see. He would be at the edge, looking at me and laughing. His gaze was filled with hatred. His eyes were terrifying. I asked about the stages that followed these dreams. She said that at night, while lying in bed, she heard strange noises inside the house. As days passed, these crackling sounds increased. Why would there be crackling sounds in a house for no reason? She wondered. She later mentioned that these crackling sounds turned into voices. She said that while sleeping at night, she heard tapping on the window next to her bed, and her door made sounds as if someone was trying to force it open. What about that night? What happened before the attack on Nay? I asked. She said that she heard an unknown and dreadful voice constantly saying, "Get out of this house." It was clear what had happened. I asked her mother to give her the ointment I had prepared. I told them to read the verses and prayers I had written, and to cover all mirrors and glass surfaces with cloth. After all this was done, I applied the ointment to Sedef's nose and made her smell a dot. As soon as she smelled it, she attacked. She turned into that girl again. Her nails felt like they were tearing my flesh. She was squeezing my arm. Her mother and sister continued to recite the prayers. Sedef was speaking in Hebrew. It was evident that the jinn who had afflicted her belonged to the Musabbar tribe. I tried to pour the remaining ointment on her while she was squeezing my arm. Later, she collapsed and fell onto her bed. Her mother and sister were still reciting prayers. Blood was coming from Sedef's nose and mouth. We had to interrupt the session. I turned to Daphne and said, "Go wash your sister." I quickly went downstairs. Her mother followed me. "What happened to my daughter?" she asked. "The jinn that entered your daughter's body is very dangerous. I need to talk to it," I said. I asked her to tell me which was the least used room in the house. She said the attic had not been used for a long time. I quickly went up there. It looked like it had been empty for a long time. Just as she had described, jinn prefer empty spaces. Shadows on the wall were constantly moving. I sat in the middle of the room and started reciting prayers. Daphne was at the door, watching. Calling a jinn does not always guarantee his presence. After an unsuccessful attempt to summon a jinn, I went downstairs. Sedef had been taken to her room and cleaned. "Let's let Sedef rest. Tonight we'll continue tomorrow," I said. It was getting late. They showed me the room where I would stay, and I went to my room. During this time, I reviewed my spell books and the file containing records of previous cases. This was the first time I had encountered such a wicked being. Everyone was in deep sleep, but I couldn't sleep. That thing was around. I could feel its presence. It's sometimes quite easy to tell when a jinn is nearby. I heard strange sounds in the house. as if objects were moving. They liked to touch things. It felt like someone was watching me in the room. I went out of the room. I heard meaningless noises inside the house. As I walked around, it was as if things were shifting. I felt like someone was watching me in the room. I went out of the room. I walked around inside the house for a while and then headed towards the garden. I wanted to see the house from the outside. When I looked, the scene was the same. I saw Sedef with her eyes full of hatred and resentment staring at me through the window. I turned my head away. She got angry again. She hit the window forcefully. This time I looked straight into her eyes. Those were not Sedef's eyes. That jinn was tormenting Sedef again. It was banging on the windows as if to shatter them. Having heard the sounds, Daphne's room light came on. She started coming towards me. Every step she took towards me, the wicked entity took steps back from the window. Then it disappeared from view. What happened? Can't you sleep? She asked. I smiled. Is it hitting the windows again? She said. Does it do it often? I asked. She told me that whatever it was, it didn't want to take her sister out of this house. They were even afraid when taking Sedef to the hospital. I assured her that all these problems would pass. Daphne lit her cigarette again and looked at the house. Are you going to kill her? She asked. The jinn? I inquired. Yes, she said. Killing a jinn is like killing a human in the eyes of Allah. Besides, it has a family too. It's like a blood feud passed down through generations, I said. She fell silent. It was almost dawn. The morning call to prayer had already been recited. From this moment on, that wicked entity would leave Sedef somewhat at peace. Daphne went to sleep for a couple of hours, and I went to pray and read a book. When I entered my room, things were a bit different. Two of the paintings in the room were turned upside down. The backs of the paintings were visible. Pages 26, 126, 226, and 326 of my spellbook on the table were torn. I didn't tell anyone about this incident. I didn't want to scare and worry them. Whoever did this had clearly done it with their own presence, not by taking on someone else's form. This house was spiritually weak. No one's sins were violated, but the sensations were in that direction. I lifted my book, adjusted the paintings, and turned towards the Qibla to perform my prayers. During every prayer and supplication, it felt like murmurs and screams were coming from the trees across the house. I could hear their sounds through the open window. Jinn are within the house between the evening and morning calls to prayer. After these times, it becomes difficult for them to enter the house. They create doubts from outside. Forgetting to close the window was my mistake at that moment. I continued my prayer. As I continued, stones were being thrown into my room through the open window. They were the ones doing it. Due to the stones hitting me, there was a small cut on my forehead and a swelling on my head. I could see the blood flowing from my forehead. On the prayer rug, I got up and closed the window. The forest was not very safe at that moment. Daphne knocked on the door. Seeing me, she exclaimed in a worried voice, "What happened to your forehead?" "Don't worry. I hit the corner of the bed, lost my balance, and fell," I said. Dismissing it, I went to the bathroom to wash my face and, once again, made a rookie mistake by looking into the mirror. I remember seeing Sedef's face appearing in the mirror. After that, I felt dizzy. I don't remember much about this area, but having so many mirrors in this house bothered me. After trying to regain my composure for 5 to 10 minutes, I went down for breakfast. Sedef's meal was prepared separately for her room. While having breakfast, Daphne also arrived. She said she had given Sedef her meal. Her mother mentioned she is always fine during the day, but at night, she becomes someone else. Daphne had 4 pieces of paper in her hand. Without me asking, she said, "I found these on the stairs." I looked at the papers. These were pages 26, 126, 226, and 326 ripped from my spellbook. There were words written in blood on them. Daphne and her mother were looking at them with fear. All 4 words were written in Hebrew. Jinn often speak of humans as clay in their own realms. On page 26, it said, "Return to your home." Clay. On page 126, it said, "The God of this place is mine." On page 226, in Hebrew alphabet, it said Daphne, and on page 326, it said the name of her mother. When they asked, I didn't tell them the meaning of these. I just said, "I don't know," and brushed it off. Later, I called my mentor, Abidin. I asked him about the meaning of pages 26, 126, 226, and 326. After some research, he asked me to listen carefully while he was speaking. The house seemed to be filled with murmurs and screams from the trees outside. I could hear them through the open window. He said these numbers are used in a specific type of spell. It was said that this spell emerges after for generations of grandchildren, when the youngest grandchild reaches 26 and the oldest reaches 326. This spell is activated. Daphne was 26 years old. If this was true, the spell would be cast on her. When I asked about this, he said the Musabbar tribe first seeks revenge from family members. The last one to die becomes the sacrifice. I knew Daphne's age was 26. I closed the call and went to the living room. I asked her mother about the age her mother-in-law would be today if she were alive. After thinking and calculating for a while, the result came out. Daphne's father was the youngest in the family, so there was a significant age difference between Daphne and her grandmother. After the calculations, the result was 126. Apparently, someone who knew the family well had performed this spell on them. I explained the situation to them. They said, "There is no one around us who would do this to us. We are a lonely, introverted family." But this needed to be confirmed before the session of speaking with the evil entity that I would do at night. I went to check on Sedef's condition once more. There were traces of blood between her fingers. When I opened her arm, I saw a fresh wound. Clearly, the blood on the papers belonged to her. I closed the curtains of her room and covered the mirrors and headed down to the stairs. At that moment, I remembered that my phone was left in Sedef's room. When I returned to the room, the paintings I had closed had returned to their old state. The covers on, the mirrors were open again, and the curtains of the windows were pulled back to the fullest taut as I was leaving the room. Sedef was saying in Arabic, "I am not afraid." I went downstairs without saying anything. At that moment, my phone rang. It was Abidin. "These numbers have a meaning. Now open your ears, listen carefully," he said. I went to a chair and sat down. listening to what the mentor had to say. He explained that these numbers are used in a specific spell. It was said that this spell emerges after for generations of grandchildren. When the youngest grandchild reaches 26 and the oldest reaches 326, this spell is activated. Daphne was 26 years old. If this was true, the spell would be cast on her. When I asked about this, he said, "The Musabbar tribe first seeks revenge from family members. The last one to die becomes the sacrifice." I knew Daphne's age was 26. I closed the call and went to the living room. I asked her mother about the age her mother-in-law would be today if she were alive. After thinking and calculating for a while, the result came out. Daphne's father was the youngest in the family, so there was a significant age difference between Daphne and her grandmother. After the calculations, the result was 126. Apparently, someone who knew the family well had performed this spell on them. I explained the situation to them. They said, "There is no one around us who would do this to us. We are a lonely, introverted family," but this needed to be confirmed before the session of speaking with the evil entity that I would do at night. I went to check on Sedef's condition once more. There were traces of blood between her fingers. When I opened her arm, I saw a fresh wound. Clearly, the blood on the papers belonged to her. I closed the curtains of her room and covered the mirrors and headed down to the stairs. At that moment, I remembered that my phone was left in Sedef's room. When I returned to the room, the paintings I had closed had returned to their old state. The covers on the mirrors were open again, and the curtains of the windows were pulled back to the fullest dot as I was leaving the room. Sedef was saying in Arabic, "I am not afraid." I went downstairs without saying. The wax on her was as if its fire would burn my face. The writings on the paper had been erased. She didn't react to the Arabic words I spoke. She was only disturbed by the prayers I recited, so I started speaking and blowing in Hebrew. "What do you want?" I asked. I turned my head towards the paper. Slowly, writing began to appear. It said, "Revenge." When the writings on the paper were erased, I asked again, "Where are you?" The shape of the house was visible on the paper. It was like a map drawn in blood: the house, the garden, the shore, and the forest left for dots at certain places. These dots had the numbers 26, 126, 226, and 326 written on them. The point with the number 26 was Sedef's room. I don't remember the rest. When I woke up, the map was intact. I took the map and went downstairs with Ianam and Daphne. I showed them the map and told them that we needed to go to the marked location. At first, they didn't approve. They still had doubts about me and the jinn. "Do you want your daughter to be well?" I asked. We headed towards Sedef's room. According to the map, there were 4 marked points. The closest and the first point, number 26, was Sedef's room. When we entered the room, Sedef was in her bed, looking perfectly normal. Daphne and her mother were with us. I needed information about this room. I asked her to answer my questions only, and I started asking. Before starting my questions, I applied a certain ointment that I had prepared beforehand to one of her hands. "Smell this ointment if you feel uncomfortable in your other hand." I wrote the Surah Sulaiman in Hebrew. I insisted that she repeat my words exactly. She nodded. Her eyes were filled with tears. "Is the disturbing entity's name Ikur?" I asked. She nodded again, confirming it. She continued crying. "Is it here right now?" I asked, and once more. She nodded. "Where?" I inquired. Her gaze turned towards the mirror. As her mother and sister were about to turn towards the mirror, I warned them, "Don't look. The malevolent entity is hiding inside it. Don't approach. Your faces will be shattered." I said, "Sedef, my dear, there's nothing to be afraid of now. Slowly read the surah you wrote on your hand," I told Sedef. She began reading, and the mirror across from her burst into a loud noise. The number 26 was written on the wall. Her mother and sister were thoroughly frightened. Sedef claimed that it was still there. I asked her mother to bring something to carve the wall. While they went to find tools, I was taking care of Sedef. In the meantime, she was looking at specific points in the room and saying, "He's here right beside us." At that moment, her mother and sister arrived. We quickly started working on the wall. There was a significant tone difference in the area where the number 26 was written on the wall, indicating that this part of the wall had been sealed later. After breaking 2 or 3 consecutive bricks, it was revealed. A paper in the shape of a human body came out, surrounded by the words Curse of Musabbar. This meant something malevolent. It was one of the worst things that could happen to a person. On the back of the paper, Sedef's name was written prominently. "A spell has been cast on your daughter," I said. The mother and sister were in shock. Sedef was looking bewildered. She asked what this writing meant. "Was the voice you heard a male voice?" I asked. "Yes," she replied. "Whoever did this evil had subjected Sedef to the Musabbar tribe. Whoever cast this spell had ruined both Dikur and Sedef's lives. When jinn are possessed through magic and cause suffering to humans, they themselves feel anguish. The phrase Curse of Musabbar was very dangerous." I put the paper in my bag and instructed Sedef to wash thoroughly and not to sleep until the morning call to prayer. While her mother and sister took her to the bathroom, I went downstairs to think. It was too late to look at the other points on the map. I was wondering why someone had given me a clue about this spell. Was Dikur the jinn also in agony, or were there traps in these points? Intending to lead me to my death, I knew I was in a high-stakes situation. While her mother and sister were taking her to the bathroom, I went downstairs and started thinking. It was too late to check the other points on the map. I was pondering why someone had given me a clue about this spell. Was Dikur the jinn also in agony, or were there traps at these points intending to lead me to my death? I knew I was in a high-stakes situation. Sedef, Daphne, and their mother, Ihanem, were sleeping in a different room. We had changed Sedef's room. She shouldn't sleep where magical materials were present. Hours had passed. The evening call, too. Prayer had been recited. After performing the evening prayer, I closed all the windows and doors of the house by reciting prayers. The Dikur and Musabbar jinn tribes would start infiltrating the house. We couldn't be at ease until the morning call to prayer before going to my room. I knocked on their doors one last time to check on them. They were all sitting and chatting. It was evident they were talking about amusing things. Sedef was smiling. Her smile made us happy too. Then I went to the room assigned to me. However, there was a glitch. It was by the window. It was Looking outside, it was my clothes, my hair, my reflection. I don't know if you've ever experienced it, but seeing yourself through someone else's eyes is one of the most terrifying things in the world. Slowly, it turned its head towards me. Its face was very dark and filled with anger. "El Hack," it exclaimed. My body was frozen. I watched it pass through the wall and head towards the forest. I had seen a jinn in the guise of someone else many times, but for the first time, I was seeing my own likeness. I did nothing. These matters were beyond my knowledge. I went to the bathroom to wash my face. I washed my face. I looked into the mirror. Different expressions, a different face, as if there was someone else in front of me. While I looked at the mirror with concern, the reflection in the mirror was smiling, some jinn, seeking refuge in toilets and bathrooms, succumb to their desires and try to engage in sexual intercourse with humans without being noticed. When I started hearing laughter from the bathroom, I realized that I shouldn't stay there any longer and that I needed to wait for the morning call to prayer. I went downstairs. It seemed like the voices of Sedef, Daphne, and her mother had been silenced. I hesitated to open their doors. I knocked twice. There was no response. I went to the living room, looked into the garden. Everything was calm. At that moment, my eyes were drawn to the place where Sedef's room was. Sedef was at the window again. She was looking at me hostilely. Vindictively, she hit the windows again. This time it was different. Every time she hit that window, it felt like glass shards were piercing my brain. I hurriedly entered the house. I went up to Sedef's room. She had thrown her mother and Daphne into a corner and was standing in front of me. She was saying, in Hebrew, "Your Lord has abandoned you," and saying it with malice, with vengeance. One after another. I read the chapters of Falak and Nez, slapping her as I read. The more I hit, the more she seemed to lose strength, becoming weaker. Finally, she was exhausted. I carried her downstairs in a faint state. I told her mother and sister that this had escalated beyond control. "We must kill Curse," I said. "But before that, we needed to dig the marked places on the map again." I showed the map to her mother and asked where the marked places 126, 226, and 326 were located. Point 126 indicated the well end. The garden, point 226, was at the bottom of the big rock on the shore. Point 326 was a spot in the forest and was the most difficult one. Until dawn, Curse will be in the house. If he regains his strength and disturbs Sedef again, let her smell the ointment I used. Sedef will faint, I said, while Daphne stayed with her sister. I went to the well with her mother. She said the well had been closed years ago and no water came from there anymore. Still, it's worth checking, I said, and started descending into the well with a rope. It wasn't a very deep well. Finally, I reached the bottom. There was a terrible, indescribably bad smell at the bottom of the well. On the ground were eggs wrapped in a white shroud. The eggs had rotted a long time ago, and they were all different from each other. These were eggs collected from different animals. They all had the inscription in the language of Ibrahim, saying Zemsen, meaning awake, Jinn, from all the marked places. Magical materials were coming out. All eggs had the same inscription. I told Hannum to put the eggs and the shroud she had hung in the basket together, and then I climbed up. Hannum was in a state of shock, crying, "Who is the scholar? Who did this to my daughter?" She cried. "We will find out. Dawn is breaking. The morning call to prayer will be recited soon. You go and have a good sleep as a family, and I will go to the rock on the shore and the area in the forest," I said. She nodded. Seemingly agreeing, I told them to place the eggs next to the paper, cut in the shape of a human in Sedef's room. I would destroy them all together when gathered. Her mother was going heavily to the house. I walked towards the big rock on the shore. This rock was probably used as a wishing tree. There were various colored threads around it. There didn't seem to be any problem. I looked at the map and started digging the mossy area under the rock with the number 226. I dug for a long time, but there was nothing at that moment. My eyes caught the number 226 carved into the rock and the key swaying in front of it. It seemed that careful observation, not digging, was required. I took the key. But what would this key be used for? It would probably be revealed at point 326. I decided to go home from the shore to have breakfast. I planned to go to the forest after breakfast. I quickly went home. Everyone was sitting down for breakfast. Everyone was sitting down for breakfast. Sedef seemed to have no memory of what happened during the night. At that moment, I realized that no one had visited the house for days. I said at the table that maybe there were not many neighborly relations around here. "No one." Reply, Sedef interrupted, saying, "Yes, the people here are a bit strange." I smiled and asked if she was feeling better, at least during the day. She said she was better and that the evil didn't bother her as much as before. I was relieved. I asked for permission from the family. Daphne and Sedef didn't know that I was going to the forest. I gave the impression that I would go to the center of the town at that moment. Her mother came to me. "We don't talk to anyone in this town. Get your business done without being seen," she said. I nodded as if agreeing and walked towards the forest. After a while of walking in the forest, my eyes were drawn to the bottom of a distant plane tree, 3 tall. Black-clothed figures were looking at the tree. Wherever there is a human, there is a jinn, according to Prophet Solomon. At night we sleep with 3 tribes of jinn. While they were standing still, looking at the tree, I was watching them. They turned towards me. They were the evil spirits I saw in my room and in the mirror that day. They were wandering in the forest. With their long black shawls, like cypress trees, they pointed at the tree, and they walked towards the depths of the forest. As they walked, it seemed like all the crows, all the birds of prey in the forest were migrating, following them. I slowly approached the tree they were at. This time, my job was very easy. There was a small box at the bottom of the tree hollow I needed to open. That box with the key in my hand. As I lifted the lid of the box, I saw that it was empty. Once again, we were left empty-handed, and once again, we couldn't get any results. I quickly took the empty box in my hand and left the place. I had returned directly home. This incident had surpassed my abilities. My knowledge was not sufficient in order to solve this. I immediately called my teacher Abidin, narrating all the events one by one. He, too, couldn't find a solution. I then called another teacher, Ali Hoka. Ali Hoka was a person with an open spiritual insight. He used to say, "The greatest enemy of humans is their sins." And he didn't engage with Jen, only striving for the guidance of humans. As a last resort, I wanted to contact him. I called him. Ali Hoka answered the phone. After narrating all the events to him, he mentioned that he was getting old and didn't have the strength to resist Jinn anymore. Moreover, he always argued that dealing with Jinn was not right. However, he gave us a name, Shepherd Murat from Kankirk. We set off in the morning with Daphne. Daphne still had that necklace around her neck. On the back seat, there was an empty box. Although I had been doing this job for years, perhaps for the first time, I felt great fear inside me. This matter was much more complex and difficult than I thought. Even my teachers were powerless in the face of this situation. By evening, we had reached the village where Shepherd Murat lived. The village was a small place where very few people lived. Murat lived alone in the old house, inherited afar from his ancestors. After some inquiries, we found his house. The villagers called him not Shepherd Murat, but Crazy Murat. My teacher never referred to a madman as a shepherd for no reason. There must be some wisdom in it. The graves stood side by side in the garden of his house. These were the graves of his parents. His father died 3 months before Murat was born, and his mother died while giving birth to Murat. He was raised by his grandmother. She also died 10 years ago. That's why he said, "Call me not Shepherd Murat, but as real Murat." He was 30 years old when we knocked on the door. He welcomed us inside. The house was an old but beautiful ancestral home. There wasn't much furniture inside. He quickly set the table and fed us. After I told him all the events one by one, Murat started talking. It was evident that he was not an ordinary person. "Look, Brother Seymour, you also know the knowledge of this matter. Jinn live longer than humans. If one of these jinn harms my brother, that jinn will come and take revenge on him from my brother's descendants up to the 7th generation. Look at Daphne. That necklace she carries around her neck is not as innocent as you think." Pointing to the necklace, my teacher, "This necklace has been passed down from my great-grandfather. That's why I never take it off." Daphne replied, "This necklace carries the seal of Solomon, which is used to command jinn. If the person wearing this necklace does not give its right, jinn can haunt him or his family." Murat replied. Then he examined the right and left sides of the necklace. He noticed that the number 1015 was written on one corner of the necklace. I agree 1015 corresponds to the year 1687 in the Gregorian calendar. This indicated 326 years ago. The necklace was made 326 years ago. Then he asked me for the box. There were Aramaic words on the box. I couldn't decipher them. These writings turned out to be the text of the agreement made with the Musabbar Jinn tribe. Murat Hoka said, "This box was unearthed 226 years ago from where it was buried. The ones who unearthed it are your ancestors. When they unearthed it, they killed a Musabbar evil spirit. First, the death of your father was caused, and now they are bothering your sister." Daphne had started crying. We had told Murat Hoka about Daphne's father. Daphne's father had committed suicide by hanging himself, but they had kept this a secret from everyone. "Teacher, what should we do?" For Allah's sake, tell us. Daphne said, brother, first repent as a family. Give the zakat of the gold in the box and all the goods taken. Burn this box, the necklace, and the old book in your house together in a cave. Only the ashes should remain, because this box was found in that cave. That's why an agreement was made with the Musabbar jinn tribe. Scatter the ashes in the northerly wind with the permission of Allah. Everything will be resolved. Said Amur-80. When morning came, we said goodbye to Murat Hoka. After thanking him, we left as soon as we arrived home. We went to that cave and burned the box, the book, and the necklace. Only a handful of ash remained. We took it and scattered it in the northerly wind. When we returned home, Setef, along with her mother, had prepared a meal and was waiting for us. It was clear that she had recovered from every aspect. The brothers who had escaped from the Musabbar jinn tribes hunting continued their lives normally. As for Simul Hoka, he continued to distribute healing in Kudahia.